Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Monday, August 1st, 2022. I'm delighted to be here with Professor Stewart W. Smith. Stewart, it's great to be with you. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm happy to.
Stewart, to start, would you please tell me your current or most recent title and institutional affiliation?
I retired from the University of Washington in Seattle as Department of Earth and Space Sciences. A long time ago now. I retired fairly early. Must have been 1998, I guess. Yeah.
Stewart, have you been active at all in retirement? Are you staying on top of the literature, doing any research yourself?
Yeah, the first decade, I was very active. I did a lot of that was after the internet was really helpful in doing research, and so at that point I was collaborating with people at Berkeley, La Jolla, and primarily UCSD, and I wrote several papers during that period of time. I worked out of my home, and the computers made the interaction really quite easy, and so I enjoyed that a lot. I wasn't ready to give up research when I retired. I was just ready to give up university administration and some aspects of teaching.
Certainly, certainly. Stewart, at a high level, tell me about some of the broad areas in geophysics and seismology that you've worked in over the course of your career.
I did some early work with Hugo Benioff on Earth tides, and that led to being in the right place at the right time when the great Chilean earthquake occurred and excited the Earth's free oscillations. That basically made my career. So I worked in that area and in the technology of detecting underground nuclear explosions with the Frank Press, and somewhere along the line, I was still working in basically long period seismology and deep earth structure, but I got tagged to be the president of IRIS, the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, back in 84, I guess, and I went to Washington D.C. for a 4-year stint. Setting up IRIS and developing the global program for seismology. And back at the University of Washington, then my primary research activity was concerning the seismicity and the structure of the Mendocino area, the Mendocino Triple Junction, and I wrote a paper or several papers on that. So that's basically what I was involved in research.
Stewart, have you been more on the theoretical side or the observational side in your career?
Primarily the observational and calculational, if that's a term, side. Yeah, I worked with some really good theorists at Caltech, but that was not my forte.
What would you say have been some of the biggest surprises in your career? Things that were orthodox, understood to be true, that proved to be otherwise?
Oh, gosh. Well, the biggest thing that happened during my career at Caltech was the discovery of an expedition of plate tectonics. Plate tectonics didn't exist. The understanding of it didn't exist when I arrived as a grad student, and it was exciting to be in that area when the picture finally came together. We saw the relationship between the major structure plates and the tectonic process going on. That was the most exciting thing, I guess I can't think of any other really big surprises during my career. It was kind of a gradual development and understanding of what was earthquakes and what was causing them and what happened during earthquakes. So,
Stewart, what about some of the technological advances that you've seen in your career? What were some new technologies that came online that really revolutionized the field and what you were able to do?
Well, the primary thing would be digital computing. Not only the ability to do really large simulation kinds of exercises, but we developed with Bob Finney and myself and the engineers at the Seismo lab, we developed a digital seismograph, a long period digital seismograph using Benioff seismometers, and that really changed the picture of how we recorded, and thus we're able to analyze wave functions on earthquakes.
Well, let's take it back now. Before Caltech, just to establish some context, where did you do your undergraduate work?
I was at MIT. Got a degree there in 1954, and then spent 2 years in the Air Force doing a variety of different things, and then after that I applied to and entered Caltech as a grad student.
Now, as an undergraduate, were you interested in seismology and geophysics? Is that what you really wanted to pursue in graduate school?
Yes, I started off in physics, and then I was more into the classical and the physics, and geophysics appealed to me, and there were some notable people, Freeman Gilbert, among others, who was quite a remarkable geophysicist, was a year ahead of me, and we were roommates my freshman year, and he had a huge influence on me, and I suspect that's one of the big reasons that I transferred into the geophysics at MIT was his influence.
And what kind of advice did you get, or what made you think to apply to Caltech for graduate school?
Well, I was keeping track of what was going on in geophysics to a certain extent while I was in the Air Force, and that was the time when Frank Press was moving from Columbia to Caltech, and I think there was like 52 or something like that. Anyway, it was pretty apparent that Caltech was really on the horizon as a central place for seismology in the United States, and I was interested in wave propagation and that aspect of seismology, and so it seemed like a natural place to go. I applied to several other places, but that was my top priority.
Stewart, tell me about the old Seismo lab when you arrived in Pasadena in 1957. What was it like there?
Well, it was when I first arrived, I was assigned as a TA with Jerry Wasserberg on campus. But in the wintertime, and beginning in winter quarter, I was given a research assistantship with Hugo Benioff, and at that point, I basically moved my operation out to the Seismo lab, and they were just in the transition to. So they're still in the transition to being Frank Press as a new director. He came there in '55, I guess, but it wasn't appointed director until '57. So it was a grand experience. It was this mansion on the hill, filled with interesting people, and Hugo Benioff was my advisor at that point, and Frank Press director, and Charles Richter was still active. Hugo Benno Gutenberg wasn't really active. He was in the office quite a bit of the time, but wasn't interacting very much with students. But that was the crew: Benioff, Press, Gutenberg, and Richter, and and an incredibly interesting group of grad students. I mean, that was Frank attracted a bunch of people, and there were about a half a dozen of us in those days, and it was really a tight crew. Anderson, Archambault, Harkrider, Ari Ben Menahem. It was really a lot of fun. Very tight personal group. We went out to lunch every day and together, and it was an exciting place to be.
Did you know as a graduate student, at least when you first got there, that these were giants in the field? Was that apparent to you even from the beginning?
Yes, it was. Yeah. And it became more apparent as I lived with it. Yeah.
Stewart, tell me about some of the big ideas in the Seismo lab when you first arrived. What were the professors debating? What were the big issues in the field at the time?
Well, the emphasis was on Earth structure derived from waves, and so a broad approach to that, from mathematics and computer modeling of waves in the Earth to a central problem was what we call the inverse problem. Given a set of data from waves arriving at seismographs around the world, how do you derive what the waves had passed through, what the structure was that had influenced them? And that was a primary focus. Harkrider and Press did some of the earliest work on calculating how the waves would travel through the Earth, and that was modeling that was just then becoming available with the computing power that we had. And Anderson and others were at the other end figuring out what the structure would be given that data, and so that was the primary focus. And in my case, it didn't shift to free oscillations, which is the ultra long period end of the spectrum, until the Chilean earthquake occurred. Benioff had always been interested in free oscillations, and he early on, I think back as early 1950s, there was quite a large earthquake in Kamchatka, and it produced a big long wiggle. It looked like maybe 1.5 or maybe 2 cycles of something around an hour in period, and he jumped on that and said that perhaps that was the free oscillation of the Earth, because there had been some calculations showing that Earth vibrations were likely to be around an hour for the fundamental mode, but subsequently it was pretty clear that was an artifact of the data. It was just an accidental swing of the seismographs, but but he continued to really look hard at that. That was his focus, and that developed in an interesting way. In that Benioff was very broadly interested in waves and did a lot of work in music. As an aside, I had an interview with a fellow who wrote a quite a lengthy scholarly article about Benioff. Are you aware of that?
No.
Oh, you should probably be. His name was Matthias.
Oh, yes.
Okay, right. And it's published by the University of California Press.
Mm-hmm.
It's really long. I learned a lot of things I didn't know about his early life. Anyway, he was also interested in physics and in the idea of gravitational waves back in those days, and he thought that perhaps the Earth might serve as an antenna for recording gravitational waves. And it kind of makes sense. Perturbations in space-time pass through the Earth, and it moves, and that's what strain seismometers do. They measure the movement. So, and he was a good friend of a physicist, Weber, back at the University of Maryland, who was doing experiments on a giant aluminum cylinder to try to detect. He'd hit the cylinder and get it vibrating and see if he could measure it with then let it sit and see if the gravitational effects would be visible. And turned out they weren't. But he and Benioff discussed this idea of the Earth as a antenna. And so after the Chilean earthquake, they hopped on that, and together with one of Weber's grad students, Robert Forward, we looked at the background noise level of the Earth vibrations in that really long period range, and wrote a paper on established. We didn't see anything, but we established a minimum level that would be detected had there been some, and it was far above the level that actually appeared in the last decade. But that was interesting. And it was quite interesting to work on the underground nuclear detection problem as well. And I worked on after a big explosion underground, some period of time afterwards, minutes or hours, the entire cavity would collapse, and it was such a big event that we got a definite seismic signal from the cavity collapse. And so I did some work in that area as well.
Stewart, what was the process of determining that Benioff would be your thesis advisor? Did you go around and work with all the others? How did that play out?
Well, it happened kind of naturally, and I was his research assistant, so I worked on things he wanted me to work on, and it started off earth tides, and that was an era that prior to that time, earth tide analysis, basically harmonic analysis of ocean tides, was done with desktop calculators, Marchand type mechanical calculators. And so the digital computers were just having an impact, and with new programs for spectral analysis. And so I was doing spectra of earth tides. He had strain seismographs in Hawaii, Peru, and California. So that was the data set I was working on. And when the Chilean earthquake occurred, that was the type of analysis that one would do to detect free oscillations. So Benioff basically tagged me with that, and I could see that's the first time I could see a thesis coming, and so basically it was just kind of happened naturally that he was my advisor. I got a lot of advice from Frank Press. Benioff was in his later years then, full of ideas still, and a delight to talk to. But I got my mathematics and computer questions answered from Frank. He was kind of the background as not a thesis advisor, but he certainly had a big role in the thesis. And I should say that there was a certain element of friction in the Seismo lab in those days. That Frank had been appointed in 1957 as director, and it was never openly discussed, but it was pretty clear that Benioff thought perhaps that was premature. So that there was friction there, but it didn't affect the interactions much. But you could kind of feel it in the background. And so I was Benioff's student, but Frank was a very important ingredient in my thesis.
Let's start with Benioff first. What was he like as a person?
Well, he was charming. He was erudite, and I did some travel with him in connection with some committees. There was one particular committee, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. They were funding Caltech for the research in underground detection, and so he was on that committee, and he got me on the committee as well. And so I got a chance to see him in kind of a social environment at these various meetings and travel. And he had a wonderful sense of humor. He could tell jokes. People at Caltech didn't really seem to realize that, but I certainly did dealing with him. He was very humorous. And very, very broadly interested in sciences and in particular in waves of all kinds. So he was fun to talk to, and there were a lot of really good ideas floating around that he was pushing.
And then Frank Press, could you tell, just to sort of fast forward where his career went, that he was already on that trajectory as early as the late 50s?
Oh, yes. He was, late 50s. He was.
In other words, was he already involved with Washington, D.C. and policy and things like that?
Yeah, that happened. That happened with the onset of the underground nuclear testing, and that's he was basically the guiding light behind getting a global seismic network going that the USGS established. And so he was clearly the leader in that field as early as 1958, 59. Yeah.
Tell me about developing your thesis. Let's start first on the technological side. Were there computers, even in their very earliest forms, that you could work with, circa 1959, 1960?
Yeah, yes, there were. I'll start with Caltech. Caltech had an ancient, really ancient digital computer. I can still see it now. It used vacuum tubes. That's how old it was. And it was programmed with assembly language, and it was good for calculations, but slow. David Harkrider at the lab was the most active user of it from our group, and he did his early inversion programs for radio waves on that computer, which is remarkable because programming a thing in machine language is really a huge task. But that was also the period of time when IBM sponsored what they called the Western Data Processing Center at UCLA. And that was the only major digital computer in the West Coast at that point. It was I started off, I think, as an IBM 704, but it was a 709 by the time I got there. And so it was punch cards, and a number of us were running our programs at UCLA. And so we'd laboriously prepare the punch cards, write the programs, and then drive down Sunset Boulevard all the way to Westwood because there was no freeway at that point. Hollywood Freeway was not completed. And submit a box of cards at a desk. You never actually saw the computer, just gave them to the desk, and then went back to Pasadena. And then the runs were overnight. So the next morning you drive all the way to Westwood and get your output. And a lot of times the output came back and said, format error. So time wasted. But anyway, that was quite a hassle. So Frank worked pretty hard to try to get his own computer at the Seismo lab, and he did manage to buy a Bendix G15 computer. It was an early digital computer, and it was quite capable, but it was a little hard to program. The story is that Caltech administration didn't want any, it wasn't going to support computers in other departments. They were going to have a computing center, but it wasn't really functioning at that point. And so Frank decided to buy this Bendix computer, and to get approval, he had to go through the administration. And the story, as he tells it, is that the person the high administration official he had to get to for approval on this, he managed to get him on the telephone while he was out playing golf. And that was why he got approval. If you can kind of read behind the scenes. Anyway, that's just a minor thing. Subsequently, Caltech got an IBM 360 computer, and they were, at that point, we could work on campus, and it was still punch cards and paper tape, but no, Bendix computer was paper tape, punch paper tape, but the Caltech IBM was punch cards, and so that's where I did most of the subsequent work on my free oscillations. Ran into interesting people there. You could identify people. You put your boxes of cards on the shelf to be processed, and your initials usually on the box in felt tip pen, so that you could recognize where the box was. And so you got to know the people there by their initials, and so the DGH was Harkrider, and SWS was me, and then Kip Thorne was Kip.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I ran it in the evenings of the computer, but never discussed anything of substance with him. I didn't actually realize that he was involved in at that point in the early thoughts about the LIGO experiment, and which was close interaction with us conceptually, because LIGO is a really long laser interferometer for measuring distance changes, and that's what a strain seismometer is. Ours was only 50 meters long, and his was 2 kilometers long. That was an interesting connection. Let's see, with computers. Yeah, and it was and the other thing is, in terms of software, Frank Press was friends with a number of high officials at the Sandia Corporation in New Mexico, and they had a big computing center there, and so he sent David Harkrider and myself over there to learn about their spectral analysis programs and to run some test data. So that was an important part. It was early on. That was they had the most advanced spectral analysis software going, and so we copied as much of that as we could.
Stuart, I wonder if you might explain, long before online databases and the internet, decades before these advances, how was data shared at a place like the Seismo lab, and was it proprietary to some degree, meaning that scholars from other institutions would physically have to come to the Seismo lab to access it?
Well, there was early on in the 30s, there were programs. They recognized it was important to have international exchange of data, and so they're already established. The major universities, the administrative process of sharing data, and it was shared in the form of actual seismograph records, sheet of paper 12 inches wide and a meter long. And so you could write, I wrote to in connection with the one project I wrote to Uppsala in Finland, Uppsala University, and they sent me original recordings, and then I analyzed them and returned them. And so that was going on throughout the world, people exchanging that kind of data. It was still that way in the late 50s and early 60s, but people weren't sharing digital data at that point, but they were still sharing paper records, and then people would, whatever kind of analysis they were doing, they would digitize the records, and so Benioff would send original records to other people at the universities who were his friends, and they would do their own analysis. The sharing of digital data, I'm not quite sure. That didn't get formalized really until quite late. DARPA had the first international data exchange thing going on, and so seismology kind of tacked onto that in a natural way because DARPA was funding the research on nuclear detection discrimination. And so, as I recall, we used DARPANet to send files. There was no center for sending it. We would send files to Berkeley or ECSD, depending on who we were working with. And then I was involved in setting up the IRIS data center, and that and the USGS data center were the primary places then for digital data sharing, and that didn't really take off until the 70s, to my knowledge anyway. And now it works just beautifully. You could sit at your desk at your home and get just gobs of data, do whatever you like with it, and it's just almost instantaneous.
Stewart, you mentioned DARPA. Do you remember, was the Cold War a big issue for the Seismo lab, nuclear testing, verification, and things like that while you were there?
Huge. Yeah, and we were, of course, quite close to the Nevada test site, and so the tests were classified, and when the detonation was going to take place was a secret, but somehow or other, Frank always knew when it would be, and when we saw a rope across the bottom of the driveway of the Seismo lab, we knew that there was going to be a test that morning, because cars driving into our parking lot would disturb the seismographs in the basement, in the tunnel beneath the building. And so we didn't want any cars moving in the parking lot when there's tests going on. So it was kind of a joke there. You see a rope and a little flag, and you knew that at the driveway, and you knew that there was going to be a test that day. But yeah, it was huge in a number of respects. The research opportunities and the funding. The funding was really important, not only for stations in remote areas, but also for just the analysis of data. That was the primary places that were involved were UCLA, Columbia, and Caltech, and it was really a major effort because in those days you looked at the seismogram and the wiggles, and you couldn't tell whether it was an earthquake or an underground explosion. For smaller earthquakes, anyway, they were comparable looking wiggles, but there were subtle differences that you could bring out with the large data sets and with the digital processing. So that was a major activity in 60s and 70s. It funded a lot of research that ended up being useful, not in general for Earth structure. I mean, the motivation for the analysis and for the instrumentation was for the test program, but the output was just huge for seismology in general.
Tell me about the culture at the Seismo lab. Did you feel sort of sequestered off from the rest of campus? Did you feel like you were at Caltech?
Yes, although there was this element of separation there. I couldn't avoid that. But we taught courses on campus, and we had students who were on campus and taking courses, but also then as I started off, coming out to the lab part of the day and doing research work. So I don't. There was no friction. There was no separation, I guess. There occasionally you could sense a little competition for funding, but that was, I think, natural in any university set up. Yeah.
What was the process like intellectually of setting up your thesis research? In other words, what were some of the bigger questions in the field at that point, and what was the narrow slice of research that you focused on to address some of those broader questions?
Well, it was pretty narrow. I mean, the idea was that the Earth is a giant elastic ball with some complicated structure inside, and if you bang it with a giant hammer, it's going to ring like a bell. And the only question was, is our earthquake a big enough hammer to get the excitation or vibrations big enough we could measure them? And so it was really a pretty simple problem. It's basically you're given a black box and you're measuring what it's doing, and you can describe it mathematically in a very classical way. I mean, the harmonic analysis was developed in the last century. So weren't any surprises there. The main question was that getting the kind of data that you needed in the volume that you needed, and then being able to crank through really long calculations on a digital computer. So I would say there weren't any mysteries involved. One of the central questions was having to do with the instruments. Seismometers measure the motion of the Earth and in the vertical and horizontal directions, but they're most precise in measuring vertical motion, and so there was a central idea. You can see my hands here. The oscillations of the Earth that produce vertical motion are called spheroidal, and that's the Earth goes back and forth between a football shape and a oblate spheroid, and there is vertical motion there, and that's very easy to measure with the seismometer. But there are also torsional rotations where the Earth twists like that, and it turns out the strain seismometers were basically the only instrument that was sensitive to that kind of motion. And so there was a lot of interest in trying to detect and isolate these so-called torsional or toroidal oscillations from the spheroidal. That was interesting problem. And so we managed to make the first measurements of the torsional mode as well. What was the rest of your question here? Let's see.
Just the big questions in the field and how you saw your thesis research being responsive to them.
Oh, well, the big question, the big questions were, what is the structure of the Earth? And for seismology in particular, a really huge question was what goes on during an earthquake? I mean, it's some kind of rupture and that over very large distances where a big chunk of the Earth slides next to another, the plates are moving and so forth. And the way we addressed that was by modeling. You make a model, a mathematical model of how a rupture might initiate and propagate and then stop. And what happens at the start and the stop, and what was the velocity of the rupture, and how big was the surface? So that was basically another inverse problem. We were to try to work backwards from the data we saw to what actually happened at the earthquake source. As that and Earth structure were the central problems of seismology. The idea of discriminating between an earthquake and a nuclear explosion, that's just kind of a little side thing that's just a technical detail, but not fundamental. And the problem is still not fully understood as to what the initiation of a rupture in the Earth and what controls its propagation, and what can we measure about what's going on, and more importantly, is there anything we can measure at a time that tells us that it's likely to rupture? And the clue there might well be the data from small earthquakes, because clearly big earthquakes occur where small ones are going on already. So there's some commonality there, and so I'd say it's a major focus is to try to figure out from all the thousands of earthquakes going on all the time, is there any diagnostic signature as to when a large earthquake is about to occur? And the answer as of now is no. But people have not given up on that problem.
Stewart, what were some of the theories in the field at the time that might have provided some intellectual guidance for what the data was telling you?
Well, the theories were, in terms of the earthquake process, the theories were primarily coming out of rock mechanics, out of the laboratory, where people were looking in really great detail at the initiation of a rupture and so forth. And there's a lot of work in that field. That's not my area of expertise, but and there were lots of models of well, what could go on. I mean, there are a variety of different properties of rocks that you can only get by measurements in a laboratory. But there's an element of viscosity and the effects of pressure and temperature on rocks, how that varies with depth. Both pressure and temperature increase greatly with depth. And that has a big effect on the models of how a rupture might initiate and propagate.
Stewart, did your thesis research have a lot of field work involved?
No, it was all computer work. Reducing the big part of it was reducing the paper records from ink chart or photographic recordings. They're wiggly lines. Reducing those to digits over very large amounts of them. And as kind of an aside, one of the Benioff strain meters produced a strip chart recorder that 30 feet long, with ink lines on it, and that was fairly easy to digitize. But the rest of the seismographs in our network were photographic recordings on drums. You probably have seen the drums, where and the galvanometers shining a light on them, and it's photographically recorded. All these wiggly lines, and for most of seismograph analysis, you find a wave packet or something, and you look at it and you analyze it. But for free oscillations, you had to go on not for hours, but many days, or at least throughout a 24-hour day. And that means that a drum is a single sheet of paper wrapped around, and wiggly lines going around, and they get tangled. And the major job to try to figure out where does the line go when it crosses this line where the paper is separated. Are you following?
Yeah.
Okay. And there is, to this day, in the office of the division, there is the seismograph that I took both colored pencils and traced each of these lines across and tried to also it's displayed there, and you can see faintly the colored lines, and that's what I digitized to produce one of the recordings of pure oscillations. So it's that's subject to error, because given the way the lines wander from one end of the paper to the other, there remains some uncertainty as to whether I'd done it correctly or not.
Stewart, when you had a question, would you be more likely to go to Benioff or Press, or would it really depend on what the question was?
Well, my question generally had to do with calibration of the instruments, and that Benioff was right on top of that. And he had engineers working for him, so that was the route to find out about what the actual calibration was. But anything to do with computers or the analysis, Frank was my primary go-to person. Plus, the other grad students there were really important ingredient in this as well. We were a tight group, and we helped each other, and I got a lot of programming advice from Archambault, for example. So a lot of questions amongst us students were answered by other students.
When did you know you had enough to defend? When did it feel like it was a complete project?
Well, I had the results on 3 or 4 of the fundamental modes of the Earth, which are the most interesting. I had that in the summer of 60, I guess. And Press was going to a conference in Europe. Oh, it was the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, IUGG meeting. He was going there, and the data was just starting to come out of the computer. And so I was taking those numbers and sending telegrams to Frank in Helsinki, I guess he was at the meeting. And he was reporting it to the world at that point. And so, I knew right then that this was a thesis.
Who was at your defense, besides, of course, Benioff and Press?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, the faculty, all of, I think, Clarence Allen, Jerry Wasserberg, and then Caltech would bring in people from, I had a minor in mathematics, and so they brought in the professor that I had for theoretical matrix analysis. What was his name? Todd. Yeah, he's an abstract mathematician, and luckily he didn't bring up any abstract mathematics in it. He just sat and listened, thought it was interesting. And the other person that came from another department, it was in physics, was Smythe. Have you ever heard the name Smythe?
Yes.
A fearsome course, a year-long course in high density electromagnetic theory. God, that's the hardest course I ever took in my life. And he came to me and was silent. Didn't ask me any questions. I was so thankful. I thought he might say, I'm at the blackboard, and he might say, how might you do a conformal transformation of this equation? Anyway, he was thankfully very silent. They were very interested. Everybody was interested. I mean, this is exciting stuff. And there was one other member from geology. I can't remember who it was now. And of course, Frank and Hugo.
Stewart, what were some of the big conclusions or contributions of your thesis looking back?
Well, I don't know whether the actual numbers were very helpful for people who were doing modeling of the Earth. They could tell whether their models were correct or not. But the most interesting things to me was the discovery that the fundamental mode of the Earth, instead of being a single line in the spectrum, a single frequency, it was split into 2 or 3 lines. And splitting of spectral lines is very, very common in physics, and plays a central role in spectroscopy and identifying what's going on in an atom. And there are theories for the magnetic field, for example, will split the spectrum of elements. But in the case of the Earth, it was the rotation of the Earth which produces oblateness. So it's not a perfect sphere. If it had been an absolutely perfect sphere, the lines in the spectrum would have been single lines. But instead there were 2 or 3 lines, and then George Backus at UCSD at Loya Labs was doing analysis of this kind of thing, and he was able to mathematically calculate the effect of how the spectrum would be split if it's not a perfect sphere but an oblate. And so he had predictions as to how much the splitting would be. And the fact that we could see it in the Earth oscillations was really, I thought, quite extraordinary. And it turned out to be helpful for the people who are doing this inverse problem to determine Earth structure as well, because it just gave you one more number that was controlling what the spectrum should look at. That was interesting. And the other interesting point was that there is, in addition to the kind of football mode or spheroidal mode, there is a totally radial mode where the Earth basically expands and contracts. That's excited by a big earthquake. And it's a puzzle as to why earthquakes would do that, because usually there would have to be some kind of a volume change, but to produce strictly compressional motion. But somehow or other, something happened in the big earthquakes, the stress release over a large area or so forth, that it produced these radial oscillations, which are since there's no shear motion involved, the attenuation of the die-off of the vibration with time is much less. So the spheroidal oscillations die out over a period of many hours, but the radial ones go on for days. That was a big surprise. That a couple of weeks after the earthquake, you could still detect the the radial mode, which is around 20 minutes or so in oscillation. And that was really, I thought, pretty interesting. But going through all the spectra and getting all the lines is just kind of grunt work. And once the process was established, we had the data. And so there was a lot of computing, but it wasn't necessarily very exciting.
After you defended, what opportunities were available to you? What did you want to do next?
I wanted to continue work in that area with the kind of data that was available at Caltech. So Caltech was high on my list. I thought it was just out of the question. I mean, it's very unusual for graduate students to continue on the faculty at Caltech, and so I kind of ruled that out.
What about as a postdoc?
I was more interested in a more permanent position, so I wasn't seriously. I would have considered it, but I was looking for other opportunities. So I was in contact with people at UCSD in San Diego, Walter Monk, and I think he was prepared to. As a matter of fact, they did make a job offer. Yeah, and Stanford. I even wrote to the University of Washington, desperately hoping to get back to the Northwest because that's where I grew up here, and I never got a reply. The geology department was they had some seismologists who were doing work on earthquakes here, but very small efforts. So they never replied. Anyway, and then and UCLA. So UCLA, San Diego, and Stanford I applied to, and then Frank came up with an offer at Caltech, and that was something I was beyond my dreams, so I grabbed it.
What was the offer initially?
Let's see. It was $6,500 a year. Somewhere in 6 or something. And my wife, while I'd been a grad student, my wife Nancy had supported me she was teaching in the Pasadena school system, and then we had 3 children in a row. And so it was helpful to have a salary. We could live on $6,000 a year.
What ultimately did you decide?
Ultimately, what?
What ultimately did you decide?
Oh, I instantaneously accepted it.
What was your title?
Assistant professor. And
it was a tenure track position?
Yes. The tenure decision isn't made for 7 years, but it was a track, yeah. So it was unusual, and Frank managed to get 2 appointments that year, Bob Fitty and myself, and so Bob was there for a couple of years, and then he left for Princeton, and he was one of my close colleagues because he was a real expert in high energy digital computing, and he was really the leader in the digital seismograph operation that we set up at the lab. So I missed him when he left, but and then when he left, Don Anderson had just completed his thesis, and it was a natural thing. The lab needed that kind of effort in earth structure, and so Don that position.
Now, what aspects, when you joined the faculty, did you want to continue from your thesis research, and where was there opportunity for new lines of inquiry?
Well, it was basically at that point, it's basically up to the individual faculty members to decide because there is not much central funding out of the administration for research. So if you're going to do research, you have to have proposals, and you have to have them get funded by the National Science Foundation or the USGS and so forth. So I wrote some proposal on continuing work on trying to measure the attenuation. That there's a number that describes how rapidly an oscillating system will die away. It's really important for getting at what the structure of the material is, which we call Q. And so I wrote some proposals to try to measure Q from the free oscillation data. And I wrote some proposals to DARPA for earthquake source analysis, which was fundamentally trying to derive the properties of the source from the seismic waves. And it had some applications to underground explosions, but wasn't directly addressing it. It was just fundamentally what's going on with this rupture going on in the earth. So those are the areas that I was interested in at that point. And I was able to get funding from different agencies to carry out those programs. Did
you take on your own graduate students at that point?
Yeah. I was able to fund graduate students, and one of them, Charles Samus. We continued our interaction over the years, and after I retired, he was on the faculty at UCSD, and so he was one of my primary collaborators in the several papers we wrote during the 90s. That was kind of interesting. And I had some other students went on. Francis Wu, who is on the faculty, or was, and he's probably retired now in New York, and Leon Tang, who was out on faculty at UCSD, and then several who went into the industry, and one who did a good thesis and then went back and worked in his father's company. So,
Stewart, ultimately, how long did you stay on the faculty at Caltech?
So 9 years, I guess. Yeah, I was appointed in '61, and I did a sabbatical at Tokyo University back in '68, '69, and then I got an inquiry from the University of Washington about coming up to chair a new department while I was in Tokyo, and I was so desperate to get back to Seattle. I wrote back and said, "Oh, I'll come up for an interview. I'll just come over from Tokyo." They said, "Oh no, don't bother. We'll wait till you get back next summer." But my heart was in this area, and when we were graduate students, just sit around in the evening at the Seismo lab discussing what places we would like to live after we graduated and got jobs. And it was really interesting. Everybody was focusing back on where they grew up. Archambault wanted to go back to Colorado. I wanted to go to Seattle. I don't recall Don wanting to go back to Baltimore, but anyway, everybody had a special place, and none of them was Los Angeles.
You're from Seattle?
Yeah, I grew up here.
Uh-huh.
So, and then, so when I got the job offer, I took it. It was a real challenge. It was really interesting. It was basically a start of a new graduate program in geophysics, and so I was handed 4 new faculty appointments to make. And we were managed out of the graduate school here rather than the College of Arts and Sciences. And so it was remarkable. Each appointment had to be shared with another department. We were an interdisciplinary group. And so I was able to get a seismologist from Nevada, an earthquake experimental physicist, rock mechanics experimentalist from UCLA, and a theoretician from Stanford. So it was a great opportunity and we had a really, really nice group going, and the department has prospered, and it's now incorporated as geology department. So it's all now one effort, and it's out of they have a new college here at the UW, College of Environmental Sciences, and it's managed out of there now. And they have a big space sciences element with planetary sciences, and so it's doing very well.
Now, you mentioned you were part of the process of creating a new program entirely.
Yeah, they decided to have the program, and they assigned people from several physics, chemistry, oceanography to participate part-time in the program. So it was kind of a committee on campus, and they wanted to make it essentially a graduate department. And so that's where I came in. I was the first appointee that was just appointed to that function. And so we maintained the ties with the other departments, but the focus was people's home was geophysics.
And your responsibility was to build up the seismology component?
Yeah. No, it was the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
I also got the new appointments in the space sciences. And there was some really fundamental work done there. And glaciology was part of that program too. And glaciology was a really big effort, and was nationally known at that time. It was nationally known, but it was incorporated into our programs, managed by geophysics.
Stewart, what were some of the funding sources at UW that made this big expansion possible?
They got a science development grant. That's what started it. A really big grant. It built a new building, equipped it with some laboratories, and made 4 new full-time faculty appointments. So it was a big commitment on the UW's part, and the dean at the time was very supportive. That was done through the College of Arts and Sciences and the graduate school, and there were several key, as you might imagine, there were key players in geology and oceanography and glaciology on the faculty who were pushing for that program, and they were really critical.
Stewart, did this new endeavor change your research at all, the kinds of things you were interested in?
Yeah, I was... I only had one research program going. I was the administration was. I was actually chair for 10 years. It turned out the tradition in arts and sciences was to switch chairs every 5 years, but somehow or other they forgot that I was out here, and they never mentioned anything about a replacement. So I finally brought it up after 10 years and said I don't want to do this anymore. But so I only had one research program going, and it was recording earthquakes and analyzing the Mendocino triple junction. And so I got outside funding for developing a network that we put in Northern California, and That basically was my primary activity while the research end of things. And I took off and did some new things after I retired. Did some earthquake source modeling with SAMUS, UCSD. It was interesting. And at that point, I was out of the administration here, but somehow or other I got roped into the Washington, D.C. operation with IRIS and established that. So
you were part of the establishment of IRIS?
Yeah.
How did that come together? What were some of the key interests that made that happen?
The key interest was that the global seismographic network was ancient. It was ancient by technology standards. It was put in with Press's push back in the late 60s, and by the time the 70s arrived, there was a whole new generation of seismographic instruments that were much more sensitive, much broader band, and digital recording. And we needed to upgrade the entire global network, and the USGS didn't have the funding to do it. And but DARPA did, and they were interested in more seismographs, particularly in Soviet Union and China. And so word kind of spread that there was an opportunity here, and then a key group of people from Columbia, Berkeley, Caltech, and UCLA, and UCSD formed a committee, and I was on that committee as well, to see what we could do to get the DARPA funding to establish a global network. It was an opportunity for science with a payoff for the Defense Department. And so we had committee meetings, and one of the committee meetings, we finally decided we really had to have a full-time staff and a central headquarters, probably in Washington, D.C. And so we all went home from the committee meeting, and we were thinking about who might do that. And it didn't occur to me to do it. I was quite happy here at the UW. But then I got the rest of the group got together, and they said they would like me to do it. And I thought it was an interesting opportunity. So I said, yeah, if I can get a leave of absence, I'll do that. But I'm not going to give up my job at the UW. And so the dean said I could take a leave of absence for 2 years and moved back to Washington and rented an office space in Roslyn across the Potomac, and took my laptops didn't exist then, so I took my big box computers, set it up on the floor in this empty office with a chair, and started hiring people and writing a proposal for the subsequent year to fund all this. So, and the committee continued to be involved. We call them the IRIS Executive Committee, and so we met once a month in Washington, and they were really took a central role. We all wrote parts of the proposal and put together this giant thing for IRIS, and the central people in that were Freeman from UCSD, Berkeley, and the acting president at that point was at Berkeley. The names are going. Anyway, all the people on the committee were actively involved in writing the proposal, and they stayed on the committee for a couple of years, and then it evolved over the years, and it's kind of changes each year now, but they still have that like guiding committee for the group. And they moved their offices downtown from Roslyn, and it's quite a large staff now. And they operate a data center, which is here in Seattle. I was accused of putting it in Seattle to be close to UW, but I didn't really have anything to do with that. And so that's the focus. People around the world make their requests to IRIS for data, and it comes by satellite directly to them.
Did you stay involved with IRIS after its founding?
Yeah, I did. I was on a couple of committees and went to meetings around the world occasionally, but then I drifted out of it because it's hard to be. I found it hard to be transitioned from chief executive officer to a committee chairman who would request things. An ego thing, I guess. Anyway, so I was quite happy here at the UW, so I just kind of faded out.
Well, Stewart, now that we've made it up to retirement, for the last part of our talk, I want to ask a few broadly retrospective questions, then we'll end looking to the future. So first, had you kept up with the Seismo lab over the years? Were you in contact with your former colleagues? Paid attention to what was happening?
I did for the first decade, but I was doing my research on my own computer at home, and I taught part-time at UW for a couple of years, but then I basically faded out of that, and it's surprising. The turnover in graduate schools is such that if you're gone for 4 or 5 years or 6 years, it's a totally different place.
Yeah, yeah.
And as time went on, I lost contacts there, and the same thing was happening with Caltech. Of course, the ones at Caltech, like Anderson and Harkrider and those people were, and Wasserberg and Knophoff. Well, Knophoff wasn't Caltech. Anyway, those people were such intense personal friends that I maintained touch with them, but I didn't keep track very much. I did the a small sabbatical with Caltech. That was good. Back, I was after 7 or 8 years here, and that was good. But no, I'd have to say I did not. I made more contacts outside than I did with UW or Caltech.
Stewart, what unique perspective might you have on the Seismo Lab, being both a graduate student and a faculty member there, that others might not, who have only been one or the other?
I'm not sure if there's any. It was there's some. When the old guard was gone, Gutenberg died, Richter disappeared. He was still around. So Benioff and Press were the principal faculty focus. And then over the time that I was there, it transitioned. Everybody was gone except me and Anderson. And so I'm not quite sure how to do. I'm not sure I have any insight in that. It just seemed like a natural evolution, and there's no lesson in it other than that the powerful, intense, brilliant people affect the environment throughout, and the environment changes in response to those changes.
I'm sure you've heard this idea before that, 5 decades, 6 decades ago, in seismology, the Seismo Lab felt like the center of the world, and today it's a much different situation. How much of that do you think is about the Seismo lab itself, and how much of it is about simply the way that the field has grown and the way that data is available worldwide?
Oh, it's probably all of the above, but I would guess an important feature was the reintegration of the seismological operation with the department. The physical separation did change the interaction between faculty members, and I think it was probably a really good, healthy move to get the Seismo lab back onto the campus.
Yeah.
So there was an element of isolation, and I think that was improved by going back to the campus. They're still the leaders in the field, and other groups have developed, but you can see I can see as an outside observer, kind of almost like the public, look, the kinds of things that are going on at Caltech now are just, in seismology, are just pretty amazing. This guy who was making seismographs out of the existing underground fiber optics networks. Incredible. And I think the integration with some laboratory work that on campus is good too. Yeah. It was the Seismo lab was a wonderful environment. And maybe at the time it was just the right kind of environment to flourish. And now it's adapted to a new environment, and I think that's all in all, that's a really good thing.
Either from your time as a graduate student or on the faculty at the Seismo lab, what has stayed with you ever since in terms of collaborations, approach to the research, focusing on the big questions in the field?
In all honesty, I have to say that the biggest change for me was the amount of administrative work that I did. I never got back to the level of that I felt that I had at Caltech in that environment. And it was a natural thing, I think. I did enjoy the administrative, and there was a period of time when I was on 4 or 5 different committees, and so in Washington D.C. and it was before Iris even, and then after Iris it was just as bad. And that and the travel associated with it detracted from, and maybe a natural evolution of my own interests changes as well. But I never got back to the feelings that I had about being at the forefront while I was at Caltech. But it's a trade-off that I was happy to have made. And I think in my particular case, it was probably good.
Stewart, between the science and your administrative responsibilities, what do you see as your most significant contributions in your career?
Oh, well, I think the development of Iris and the 4 years I spent doing that is the thing that's the biggest impact that I had. Of course, the experimental work that I did on the field solutions had a big impact on the field. But if I hadn't been there to do it, somebody else would have. Yeah, in terms of impact, I would have to say it's the Iris.
what are some of the big surprises to the extent that you've kept up with literature? Things that are possible now that were not even conceivable back in the 50s?
Oh, wow. I think quite apart, the planetary sciences element of geophysics was not really comprehensible back in the 50s. I mean, that was, we were amazed by Sputnik at that point. Now you can measure moonquakes and disturbances on the atmosphere in Saturn. So space science has been a big deal. And the incredible increase in computing powers was made in calculations in the general inversion problem, where you model something by trying over and over different variations of parameters until you converge on what quote unquote truth is. That was so far beyond the computing capabilities we had in the 60s and 70s. It's just amazing. And including like using concepts from deep learning to analyze seismic data. That was beyond comprehension. Yeah. And there's stuff going on now that I really don't know about too. Lots of stuff.
Finally, Stewart, on that point, looking to the future, if you have opportunity ever to talk with current graduate students, what are the kinds of things that they're focusing on now that build on the questions that you were involved with 60, 70 years ago?
Oh, that's hard to say. I'm not sure I can even. There's certain kind of overreaching problems that are just they were with us 60 or 70 years ago. They are today, and they're not going to change much in the next 60 to 70 years. And that basically has to do with the earthquake process. Why does it happen? What's driving it? Are there any indications that you can tell when the system is sufficiently unstable that there's going to be an earthquake? And if so, what are the conditions and where is that likely to be? I mean, that was the driving force for seismology starting in the 20s, the 30s, and it doesn't seem to be the forefront of research proposals now, because in the last decade or so, people have kind of given up on the idea, but the problem is out there, and it's going to continue to influence where the research goes. And I think, we'll find out new things. We may never solve the problem. It may be, maybe it's insoluble. That's conceivable, but there's likely to be some progress.
Meaning that it's not about the instruments. It's not necessarily about the technology. It might be something just fundamentally beyond our reach.
Yeah, well, deep drilling, for example, might produce data that would change improvements in laboratory experiments where you can do things at higher temperature and higher pressure, so you're more likely to model what's going on deep in the earth. New understanding of the Earth's magnetic field and why it moves around the way it does. The Earth is really a complicated system, and there's lots of opportunities, things to work on, problems that might be solved, and some of which are not solvable, but you don't know until you've tried.
Stewart, on that note, it's been a great pleasure spending this time with you, capturing all of your historical perspective. I'm so glad we were able to do this. Thank you so much.
Sure enough.